He was born around 1210 CE in 𝙎ᴜ, a small kingdom on the upper Niger River in what is today the border region between modern Mali and Guinea, the son of a chief named 𝙎̀r𝙗 and a hunchbacked woman named 𝙎ᴜ Conde, whom his father married because a prophecy said she would give birth to the greatest king West Africa had ever seen. He could not walk. For the first 7 years of his life, he moved on all fours while the children around him ran, and the court of 𝙎ᴜ dismissed him as a cursed prince who would never rule anything. His own half-brothers mocked him openly. His father's other wives humiliated his mother in public. The kingdom that was supposed to be his inheritance treated him like a mistake. By 1235 CE, he had raised a coalition army from exile, met the most feared warlord in West Africa on the battlefield at Kyrene, and destroyed him so completely that the entire region reorganized itself around his name within a single year. The empire he founded that day controlled territory comparable in size to Western Europe, commanded a population of approximately 25 million people, ruled over 400 cities, towns, and villages, and eventually produced Mansa Musa, quite possibly the wealthiest individual in the recorded history of the human race. This is the story of how the boy who could not stand became the man who built an empire that the entire medieval world could not ignore. Sundiata Keita was born around 1210 CE in the small kingdom of 𝙎ᴜ, a Mandinka state on the upper Niger River in what is today the border region between modern Mali and Guinea. His father was 𝙎̀r𝙗, the ruling chief of 𝙎ᴜ. His mother was 𝙎ᴜ Conde, the second wife, a woman whose physical appearance the court considered unattractive and whose position in the royal household was deliberately marginal. 𝙎ᴜ was not chosen for her beauty or her political connections. She was chosen because a prophecy delivered by a traveling hunter told 𝙎̀r𝙗 that the child of a woman matching her description would become the greatest king West Africa had ever produced. The court accepted this arrangement with skepticism. What arrived confirmed every doubt they had. Sundiata could not walk. For the first 7 years of his life, he moved on his hands and knees, while every other child his age ran, played, and grew. His head was described in oral tradition as disproportionately large. His body was weak. His legs could not support him. While his father's first wife, 𝙎ᴜ groomed her own son, 𝙬♗ as the obvious and capable heir, 𝙎ᴜ watched her child crawl across the floor of the royal compound and said nothing in public. 𝙎ᴜ did not stay silent. She mocked 𝙎ᴜ openly and regularly, pointing to Sundiata as proof that the prophecy was a fraud and that the child on the floor would never amount to anything worth fearing. The moment that changed everything arrived not through divine intervention, but through humiliation. 𝙎ᴜ publicly sent a servant to 𝙎ᴜ to tell her she could no longer expect to receive baobab leaves from the royal garden because her crippled son could never fetch them himself. It was a small cruelty carefully designed to land in public. 𝙎ᴜ wept. Sundiata heard it. He sent word to the royal blacksmith to forge him an iron staff, the heaviest the blacksmith could make. When it arrived, 6 men struggled to lift it. Sundiata, approximately 7 years old, gripped it from the floor, planted it in the earth, and pulled himself upright for the first time in his life. Ancient accounts record that the iron staff bent under the force of the effort. He straightened, he walked, he crossed the compound, tore a baobab tree from the ground by its roots, and laid it at his mother's door. The court of 𝙎ᴜʀ had nothing to say. His father died shortly after, around 1218 CE, and with him went whatever protection Soghulon and Sundiata had inside the palace walls. 𝙬ⴜ was crowned king of 𝙎ᴜʀ, with his mother Sasuma directing policy behind the throne. The new regime had no use for Sundiata, and considerably less tolerance for the prophecy that had elevated his mother above her station. Reports reached Soghulon that Sasuma was consulting sorcerers on how to permanently remove the threat Sundiata represented. Soghulon chose exile before assassination could choose for her. She took Sundiata and his two sisters and left 𝙎ᴜʀ entirely, beginning a period of wandering through neighboring kingdoms that would last approximately 10 years and transform her son from a boy who had just learned to walk into the most dangerous military commander in West Africa. The years of exile took Sundiata and his family through at least 3 kingdoms. He spent time in the court of the king of 𝙝mah, where he grew into a warrior, trained in cavalry tactics and the military organization of larger states. He studied governance, observed how different kingdoms managed alliances, taxation, and military conscription. He learned the languages and customs of the peoples he would eventually need to unite. At the same time, back in 𝙎ᴜʀ, the political situation collapsed entirely. Around 1224 CE, Tzumanguru Kante, the king of the 𝙎ᴜ Empire to the north and one of the most feared military and spiritual figures in the region, launched a campaign of expansion southward. He conquered 𝙎ᴜʀ. He killed 11 of the 12 surviving sons of Nare Magan. The only one he left alive was the disabled one in exile, the boy with the bent iron staff, whom he apparently considered too insignificant to pursue. 𝙬ⴜ fled into exile of his own. The kingdom of Sasuma had poisoned Soghulon's life, and it was gone in a single campaign. And the delegations from the surviving Mandinka clans began riding outward from 𝙎ᴜʀ to find the only legitimate heir still breathing, to tell him what had been destroyed, and to ask him to come back and save what remained. He was approximately 20 years old. He had spent a decade in exile, being told by circumstances that he did not belong anywhere. He said yes anyway. The delegations from the surviving Mandinka clans found Sundiata at the court of 𝙝mah, approximately 700 kilometers northeast of 𝙎ᴜʀ, where he had spent years becoming a warrior and military commander under the patronage of the king of 𝙝mah. They brought him a picture of complete destruction. Tzumanguru Kante had not merely conquered 𝙎ᴜʀ, he had swept through the entire Mandan region, the ancestral heartland of the Mandinka people, dismantling the political structures that had organized the area for generations, killing 11 of the 12 sons of Nare Magan, and placing the entire region under a system of extraction and terror that his own people called the rule of iron. The delegations told Sundiata that every Mandinka kingdom still standing had grown tired of 𝙎ᴜ domination, and that they would follow him if he came back. He was approximately 18 to 20 years old. He had no kingdom, no treasury, and no army of his own. He said yes. What followed between 1234 and 1235 CE was one of the most rapidly executed coalition-building campaigns in medieval African history. Sundiata returned from 𝙝mah with a force contributed by the king of 𝙝mah himself, who provided soldiers in exchange for a share of future victories. He gathered the warriors of the Ouagadougou kingdom, the remnants of the old Ghana Empire, who added cavalry and additional infantry. He contacted the 12 Mandinka kingdoms one by one, each of them representing a different clan with its own grievances against Țumanģuru, and he assembled from those separate units a combined army drawn from a coalition that had never fought together under a single command. The Țōṣō king controlled an established military machine built over decades. Sundiata had an alliance of people who agreed on exactly one thing. They wanted Țumanģuru gone. The two armies met in approximately 1235 CE at Quirina, a location in the Ǩuliqoro region of what is today modern Mali. Țumanģuru Kante arrived commanding the full military strength of the Țōṣō Empire, which had spent the previous decade conquering everything it encountered across West Africa. He was not merely a military commander. He was regarded across the entire region as a sorcerer king, a man who possessed spiritual power that conventional weapons could not harm, a belief held seriously enough across the Mandan world that the fear of him had prevented any single kingdom from resisting him directly. That belief was his most powerful weapon, more powerful than any army he fielded. Sundiata had spent time in exile, learning how belief worked in the politics of the region, and he understood that defeating Țumanģuru militarily was not sufficient. He had to defeat him spiritually in public. Ancient oral tradition records that his sister Nana Truba, who had been sent to Țumanģuru's court as part of a political arrangement, used her position to seduce Țumanģuru into revealing the one thing that could break his spiritual invulnerability: the spur of a white rooster. She escaped the Țōṣō court and brought the information to Sundiata, who had an arrow fashioned with a white rooster spur at its tip and carried it onto the battlefield at Quirina. The battle itself was a collision of the two largest military forces West Africa had seen in a generation. Sundiata drove his coalition forward with cavalry at the flanks and infantry pressing the center, using the tactical principles he had studied across a decade of exile in the courts of West Africa's most experienced military rulers. The Țōṣō lines held initially, then broke. Oral tradition records that Sundiata loosed his arrow at Țumanģuru in the course of the battle, striking him and shattering the spiritual armor that had protected him across an entire career of conquest. Țumanģuru fled the battlefield and disappeared into the mountains of Ǩuliqoro. He was never seen again. His Țōṣō empire collapsed behind him. The Mandinka stormed the last of the Țōṣō cities and razed them. The victory at Quirina in 1235 CE was not merely a military result. It was a transformation of the entire political architecture of West Africa in a single afternoon. Within a year, Sundiata convened a grand assembly at a sacred site near his ancestral home in what is known as the Kurukan Fuga, or the Great Assembly. Representatives of all 12 Mandinka kingdoms and allied states gathered before him. He was formally declared Mansa, meaning emperor of the newly proclaimed Mali Empire. Each of the 12 kings planted their spears in the ground before his throne and relinquished their kingdoms to the Keita dynasty, an act of political submission that simultaneously created the most powerful centralized state West Africa had ever seen. At the same assembly, Sundiata promulgated what oral historians call the Mandan Charter, also known as the Kurukan Fuga. It is regarded by historians as one of the earliest declarations of human rights in recorded history. It prohibited the maltreatment of prisoners and enslaved people. It guaranteed food security across the empire. It established fixed exchange rates for common goods to prevent economic exploitation. It defined clear relationships between clans, specifying who held authority over what and in what circumstances. It organized a diverse empire of multiple languages, ethnicities, and religious practices under a single set of governing principles designed to produce stability rather than simply enforce obedience. Sundiata did not merely conquer the Mandan world. He designed the system that would govern it. He rebuilt the destroyed city of Niani near the Sankarini River as the capital of the new empire and organized its administration along deliberately decentralized lines, allowing each constituent territory to retain its own customs and internal governance while remaining under the supreme authority of the Mansa in Niani. He personally led the expansion of Mali's frontiers westward to the Gambia River and extended Malian control over the gold fields of Bambouk and Bouré, the two most productive sources of gold in West Africa. Control of those gold fields, combined with control of the trans-Saharan trade routes that carried gold northward to the Mediterranean world, transformed Mali from a regional power into an economic force that the entire medieval world was forced to acknowledge. He never took the field personally again after Quirina. He did not need to. His generals continued expanding the frontiers while he governed from Niani, and within 2 decades the Mali Empire controlled territory comparable in size to Western Europe across a continuous landmass stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Niger River bend. Sundiata Keita ruled the Mali Empire from approximately 1235 CE until his death around 1255 CE, a reign of roughly 20 years during which he transformed a coalition of fractured Mandinka kingdoms into the largest and most powerful state West Africa had ever produced. The Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta and the Tunisian historian Ibn Khaldun, both of whom traveled to Mali in the century following his death, confirmed his existence through independent written accounts, anchoring his story in documented history rather than legend alone. How he died is one of the unresolved questions of medieval West African history. The most widely recorded account says he drowned in the Sankarani River near his capital of Niani around 1255 CE, either during a river crossing or during a public ceremony at the water's edge. Other accounts describe an accidental injury. Ancient oral tradition preserved by the griots offers several versions and declines to choose between them. What the sources agree on is that he died approximately 20 years after the Battle of Quirina, at an age estimated between 38 and 45, having never been defeated in battle and having never lost the empire he built. His son Uli succeeded him as Mansa and continued expanding Mali's frontiers northward and westward. Within 2 generations, the empire had grown to cover over 1.24 million square kilometers across modern Mali, Guinea, Senegal, Gambia, and Mauritania. Within 4 generations, it produced Mansa Musa, Sundiata's great-nephew, who ascended to the throne in 1312 CE and became the single most discussed figure in the medieval economic world. When Mansa Musa made his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 CE with a caravan of 60,000 people and dozens of camels carrying 136 kilograms of gold each, he distributed so much gold across Cairo and the Mediterranean world that he single-handedly crashed the price of gold across North Africa and the Middle East for 12 consecutive years. That empire, that wealth, and that legacy all trace back in a direct line to the decision made by a boy in Kangaba who refused to stay on the floor. The Mandan Charter that Sundiata proclaimed at the 𝙎ᴜⴜ Assembly around 1235 CE was recognized by UNESCO in 2009 as an element of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity, one of the world's oldest constitutions, produced by an African king in the 13th century. Centuries before, comparable documents appeared in the political traditions of Europe. It prohibited the maltreatment of prisoners. It guaranteed food security. It protected people with disabilities. The man who built that document was himself a child who could not walk, mocked in a royal court, sent into exile with nothing, and told repeatedly by the world around him that he did not matter. He answered that argument once. He gripped a bent iron staff, pulled himself off the floor of the Kangaba Palace, and never sat back down again.